Hello and welcome to FSMA Friday in December, the Friday right before Christmas. Thank you so much for joining us today on how traceable are your products really. So we will give it just a minute and then we'll get started pretty quickly. We have a lot of great content to get through and we're excited to be on with you soon. We'll be right back in 1 minute. All right, we're going to get started. So just a quick reminder, I'm Nia Cannell here with Safety Chain. What is FSMA Friday? We're a monthly FSMA-related news. We talk about regulation changes and updates, industry trends, and we have always a Q&A with the Acheson Group. And FSMA Friday is brought to you by the Acheson Group and Safety Chain. So quick things for those who are new to FSMA Fridays, right? Only the panelist microphones are on. If you ask questions, please put it in the Q&A and we will save questions for the end. We also added in a new process where you can submit questions in advance via the registration form. So we do have a few of those already ready and queued up for the team as well. The recording link will be shared. We will send in a follow-up email afterwards with the recording. And then if you have any audio issues, please use the call-in number. All right. So I am so excited to welcome back Dr. Ben Miller. He has over 25 years of experience in food safety, public health, epidemiology, and infectious disease outbreak investigation. He has a PhD in environmental health and a background in infectious disease and a master in public health and epidemiology. He's the EVP of Regulatory and Scientific Affairs at the Acheson Groups, and he works across a lot of different sectors within food and beverage, food safety culture, traceability, and public health. Our next speaker, Eric Marshall, comes to us as a principal based in Washington, D.C. with the Leavitt Partners and leads the firm's life sciences groups. He's also an industry specialist in FDA regulations with an emphasis on domestic and international supply chain. He serves as the executive director of partnerships for DSCSA governance, a public-private partnership between the industry and the FDA that's committed to implementing supply chain securities protections in the U.S. And he's also a seasoned facilitator, and he leads Leavitt's robust alliance practice, leading the firm and clients build, convene, manage numerous industry collaborations with sound health policy initiatives. We're going to jump in to today's agenda. Oops, I'm moving the wrong slide. There we go. We'll have Ben go into recent regulatory updates and overviews, and I will hand it over to them.
Thanks, Nye. Good to be with you all this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. So I'm going to touch on some of the recent regulatory updates. We'll be doing a bit of a deeper dive into the FSMA 204 language that came out of the continuing appropriations, and Eric's going to spend some time in the next few slides kind of covering that, because I think it's going to certainly touch on a lot of questions that people have around FSMA 204 and traceability. Also, some additional exemptions were kind of put out there for the ag water rule, exempting certain crops as part of that continuing appropriation bill, things like grapes grown for wine growing, hops, things like that. So, if you're in those industries, you're probably well aware of that, but just wanted to capture that in some of the regulatory updates as well. Probably one of the more significant ones, just on the USDA side of the house, was that delayed verification sampling of not ready to eat stuffed chicken products. Now, these were products that have maybe historically been more highly associated with foodborne illness outbreaks, and that rule got delayed just because the agency had some concerns around the availability of some of the test methods and accuracy limitations in terms of false positives, especially at kind of low levels of contamination. So I know that's one that the meat industry has been watching quite a bit. So a couple updates there. One that's not on the slide too is the FDA had in November talked about having some public meetings around looking at allergen threshold levels. That's been pushed out to February. So if you're interested in attending those, I think you can go to the FDA website and kind of find the updated dates for that. We can go to the next slide. So Eric, I'll turn it over to you. I think you're going to chat about the language that was in the Senate bill that came out in November here.
Yeah, happy to share a little bit, and good to be with everybody. Thanks for having us today to share this. For folks who are familiar with FSMA 204, that's the traceability rule, or it's the statute that directs the traceability rule. There's been some extensions and some requirements for FDA to engage stakeholders and do some activities to try to move implementation of that rule forward and do some testing. And so, as everyone I'm sure know, the government was shut down for quite some time. And on November 12th, when the government reopened, they passed full year funding bills for portions of the government, including FDA. So FDA is fully funded through fiscal year 2026, which runs through the end of September of 2026. And so for those of you who pay attention to the news, you'll I'm going to bet, as we push deep into January, we're going to run into another potential looming shutdown. That will not affect FDA. They have been fully funded through September of 2026. As is typical, when that funding comes through, Congress often attaches various conditions on policies they care about, or their stakeholders, their constituents care about, to that funding. And so that funding bill that was passed on November 12th included several conditions related to FSMA 204. You can see here 3 conditions that were specifically in that funding bill. One, to engage in quarterly stakeholder sessions with various parts of the industry that you can see there, specifically to identify and implement additional flexibilities for lot level tracking requirements, with a specific reference to 204D there, which is the section that prohibits case level tracking. And so the specific focus in those engagements around that topic. Second, then, is within 180 days, which will be next May, FDA actually has to provide recommendations for additional flexibility on that lot level tracking requirement. What we're hearing kind of from conversations with the agency is there'll be kind of a 2-step process here. They'll make some sort of announcement. They're intending and on track to make some sort of an announcement within that 180-day time frame, generally articulating what they intend those flexibilities to be. There'll be a second step then to actually put those into effect. So they'll have to go through some additional administrative practices or processes, whether that's a guidance document, enforcement discretion through a guidance document, a reg chain, whatever the mechanism is. That'll have a little bit longer timeline, but they do intend to provide, at least what we're hearing, they intend to provide kind of some general direction and viewpoints on that flexibility by that May 9th deadline. And part of that is informed by those stakeholder engagements. And then finally, they have to do some data testing of their product tracing system. So those are the 3 that were specifically in that funding bill. Accompanying that funding bill then is a kind of a writing document that articulates kind of an explanation of Congress's intent. And so on the next slide, there's a couple of other conditions that are put in that accompanying statement. One of which if we can flip to the next slide, is a tabletop pilot as well as some reports to Congress. And so these two requirements don't have the binding force of law that the prior three do, but ultimately they express the congressional intent behind this. And unless FDA wants to start getting angry calls and letters from folks in Congress, the reality is they're going to do these things. So ultimately, you'll see on the next slide, there's really 5 things in addition to formally delaying the implementation timeline and implementing that 30-month delay. Five specific activities that they're going to have to undertake: quarterly engagements, tabletop exercise, the stakeholder engagements, and report to Congress. So that's some activity that we're expecting to see, and we know from conversations with the agency they are very actively working on. They're taking these timelines and deadlines serious, and they're doing what they can to try to move quickly and execute on these things. So again, 30-month delay, formally kind of encoded now in federal law effectively with this, and some specific increase in stakeholder engagement that you'll see moving into 2026 and throughout 2026. So how are Ben and I kind of plugged into this? So Ben and I represent and have helped the industry stand up an organization called the Partnership for Food Traceability, or PFT. PFT is a public-private partnership that we launched last year with FDA, specifically focused on a handful of things. First and foremost, we often talk about PFT kind of as the town hall for food traceability. Or maybe I should say town square for food traceability, I guess we call it. The idea there is that there's a lot of work that's been done for years now in various industries and segments of industries, and standards bodies around traceability. The work done by PTI on produce and GDST on seafood, and work done by the standards bodies, et cetera. But our view is, our vision is, how do we bring all those conversations together to cast that single comprehensive vision for how traceability should work? And how do we make some of the hard decisions, right? Instead of just kind of, as Ben often likes to say, admiring the problem and articulating and talking about all the ways you could solve it, how do we put some stakes in the ground so that people can have some alignment and understanding of where industry is and make some of those investment and implementation decisions with confidence? And as I mentioned, part of that is, as a public-private partnership, we actually have FDA and several state regulators engaged and plugged into those conversations. And so, unlike kind of traditional advocacy where you might align and kind of throw something over the fence to FDA, FDA actively participates week in, week out in our conversations and dialogue to kind of understand what's possible, where's this going, thinking about traceability as an end user, that in traceability is a system that both industry and FDA are going to be users of, and how it should function and work. And so PFT is again a nonprofit organization that Ben and I help run, that's trying to help move those conversations forward. And I'll let Ben share a little bit more about the specific work that we're up to there.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, and if we look at the next slide here, I think we outline sort of where the current work is happening in PFT. What sits above this, and Eric talked about this, we do have a board that's made up of industry and association members, so those who are going to be essentially regulated or would be covered under the FSMA 204 regulation. So since about the middle of 2025, we've had that board in place and helping us guide some of the work of the PFT. But the two primary areas where we've been focused is, one, this concept around a traceability committee. So really, what is a good blueprint for interoperability? And that I think is a word, or it's become kind of a theme in a lot of the work that we're doing now and work that's going to go forward into 2026. And if we sort of boil that down to simple terms, it's how do we electronically share data across the supply chain? Obviously that happens today, to a very large extent, but FSMA 204 has changed what those specific data sharing requirements are, and specifically where key data elements like traceability lot code or traceability lot code source get assigned and where those can be changed. So a lot of the conversation that the traceability committee's been having, and Eric tends to lead those conversations, is around what are some of those best practices. We think about those in terms of good, better, best. So what does that look like when we're defining key data elements, when we're talking about mechanisms for data exchange and interoperability? And As Eric mentioned, we're not trying to redo the work of any of the work that's been done. There are certainly data standard bodies out there that have given this a lot of thought. It's bringing that group together to say, amongst regulators, amongst industry and associations and technology providers, how do we actually execute this? How do we do it? So every other week, we've got good conversations going on in that space. And then on the other weeks, we're meeting as a pilot committee to take some of the learnings or recommendations out of the traceability committee and see if we can operationalize those in the context of this pilot committee. So over the last 8-9 months, we've been developing a simulated supply chain that looks at a lot of the products, or simulates a lot of the products that would fall under FSMA 204s and FTL food. So things like seafood, things like produce, putting those together, transforming those into a deli salad, then distributing them in a simulated supply chain. But the data that comes out of that supply chain has allowed us to work with 3 solution providers to say, how do we share these simulated data, and they're kind of best case scenario data in the sense that they're all GS1 compliant, everything's structured well, but let's plug those systems together in this hypothetical supply chain and see how that data sharing is going. And so we're in the final stages of wrapping up that interoperability pilot, and we'll be writing up and publishing a white paper with some of the learnings that came out of that particular exercise. So that should be available probably sometime in February of 2026. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk about some of the future work. So I'm going to turn it back over to Eric here in a slide or two to talk about this concept of probabilistic or calculated lot codes. And that matches up with some of the language that we saw that came out of the Senate bill for funding, looking at specific case level tracking, especially when you get from distribution center to that last point of the supply chain, going either to restaurants or retailers or convenience stores. That's been a challenge, I think, for the distribution industry or for distributors. And so, this is a way to see if maybe is there a viable approach here in looking at sort of probabilities rather than having to scan individual cases to figure out what went where and when did it go there. We'll be working again with the traceability committee on that probabilistic pilot, but we're also considering other pilots really kind of focused around data quality and data verification, but also interoperability. So one of the things that the pilot committee is going to be working on is just setting the stage for what does good look like? What are some metrics that people could do if they go out and pilot things, and hopefully using real world supply chain data, because the compliance date got pushed officially out to July of 2028. But as we all know, that's going to come quickly. And especially when we're talking about developing data systems and IT and changing operations and everything that goes into that, creating a framework for people to go out and pilot and then be able to compare their results. So compare one solution provider or one company's results to another will be helpful, we think, in terms of saying, how is the system performing overall? If we have a common set of metrics that we can talk about and a standardized way to report those, the idea is that we can all sort of learn from each other's successes and opportunities. We're also in the process of standing up a regulator committee. So that's really going to be focused on what are some of the implementation challenges from the regulatory side of FSMA 204. Obviously FDA wrote the rule, but anybody that's worked in the food safety space understands that, state and local entities play a role all throughout the supply chain in terms of regulating and inspecting, food manufacturers, produce growers, grocery stores, restaurants, convenience stores. So while FDA sort of sets the tone in terms of what the requirements are under FSMA 204, the people that go out and sometimes collect that data and do those investigations aren't always FDA staff. They're state and local health officials and ag officials in some instances. So we want to also bring that group together to have some conversations, be able to hear from industry what some of those concerns are, and be able to focus preparing some outreach material and being able to better think about and inform industry about what will enforcement and compliance potentially look like, heading into 2028 and beyond once the rule kicks in. Next slide. I'll turn it back to you, Eric, here to talk about probabilistic models.
Yeah, and we won't get into too much technical detail, but did just want to try to kind of bring this work to life for everyone. So, as Ben mentioned, there's been a lot of conversation in the industry about this idea of a probabilistic model or calculated model, whatever you might call it. So, you think about kind of at a case level in terms of capturing the lot code on the outbound in a shipping process to understand which lot codes you're providing downstream in a ship event. You kind of the default operating model, right, would be you actually have to scan that case. So you create this touch of every case to scan and capture the lot code to know which lot code or lot codes you're providing in that event. Um, and so obviously that adds a lot of kind of touches and added labor kind of to that distribution process. And so there's been a lot of conversation about this idea of using other methods to calculate what the likely lot codes are to avoid that continual touch of every case. That's an idea that industry and many in industry have kind of been proponents of and articulated and arguing for several years now. FDA's been, I think, a little bit skeptical of that model, although as Ben was saying, right, they're really kind of getting some pressure through this funding bill to take a closer look at it. And what we're doing next year and the work we're kicking off in January is to say, look, there's been a lot of this kind of back and forth about can it be probabilistic or not? Can we do this model or not? And we want to get more nuance in this and say, okay, what's the real what are the parameters around a probabilistic model that can meet the intent and objectives of the law and of the traceability rule? It's not just this abstract probabilistic model or not. We've got to start to define what would a probabilistic model look like. And so this is just the kinds of topics that we're going to be working through to put better definition around what we as a group of industry folks believe a good, reliable probabilistic model could look like. Again, with FDA at the table as part of that conversation. And so, thinking about things like, does it apply to all distribution models, or is it just something like a direct store delivery kind of a model? Does it only apply at the last model, or kind of how many times can you stack probabilistic on top of probabilistic going back through the supply chain before the data quality degrades too far? That it just isn't workable. Yeah, how concentrated or reliable between saying, hey, we think it's a 90% chance it was lot A and 10% chance it might have been one of these other lots, versus saying, I don't know, here's 5 lots, 20% chance it's any one of them, right? And so how do you start to put some parameters around those statistical methods? And then thinking through some other stuff too, like, if industry were able to kind of get be permitted to use a probabilistic model, that puts a little more pressure on things like your pallet level tracking practices, your inventory management and FIFO practices. And so, would industry take a trade-off of being able to do probabilistic model, but having the expectations ratcheted up a little bit on some of those inventory practices? Next slide. So I won't run through all of these, but you can start to see kind of some of those parameters. Again, trying to get more defined and not just have this abstract, could we use probabilistic model conversation, but actually dig into it with FDA and say, let's talk through the parameters. Nobody's suggesting every touch in the supply chain across every food product could be probabilistic. So let's get a little more defined on like what could be a probabilistic model and what would that actually look like. So again, that's just one example that we want to provide, just to kind of bring it to life for a little bit of how we're trying to move the ball forward on some of these big issues to support implementation, and in a position to do that kind of hand in hand in conversation with the agency. Next slide, which I think I'll kick back to Ben.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we often hear is sort of, what are some of the challenges going on around FSMA 204 right now as we think about traceability? I think one significant challenge is that compliance delay. So actually, when FDA announced that intent back this spring and late March, early April, I think we were looking originally to a compliance deadline of January of this year, 2026. So basically a month away, but kick the deadline out 30 months. Obviously any of us that work in the food safety space understand there's a lot going on, and I think that extension may have in some instances created a lack of sense of urgency at that point. So, oh, we've got a homework extension, let's not worry about this. But the reality is, and I think what we're seeing in a lot of the work that we do with PFT, but also with others that we work with in industry, is that, this is going to take some time to solve in terms of you may have some confidence in your own internal data system collection, but it's really when you start to share that data down the supply chain and start to receive data from your suppliers that's where some of the challenges start to arise. Because again, we don't necessarily have people assigning lot codes or traceability lot code source information yet in a way that's compliant. So we don't have great ways to test that data transfer within those systems. And then there's just the operational realities of all just sort of the different exception processes that then need to happen, even where you have good data exchange. People return things get lost, you have to rework products. So how do your processes really take a lot of that into consideration, into what are the requirements from a record keeping standpoint? Again, that lot code traceability between distribution, retail, and restaurant, that's really the focus of that probabilistic work. But that has always been a challenge because there really hasn't been a driving economic incentive for distributors to provide that information or track that information to retail. And this is also, I think, a point to make, is that traceability is different than recall, right? So oftentimes when we're having these conversations, at least initially, people say, well, I've got a good recall system, so therefore I've got a good traceability system. And the reality is that those systems kind of work in different directions, right? When we recall product, we can cast a wide net. We can say, okay, everything made between X and X date. And so when we've got dates that we can work with, most people know when they receive product, and can get that product removed, because you have to be less specific. In a traceback investigation, you're trying to figure out exactly what lot code was on that store shelf that may have been available for sale at a given point in time. And that given point in time is usually 6 or 8 weeks ago. So when an investigator is looking for that level of information, it often doesn't exist. And that's really what drove FSMA 204 to be written the way that it was. I think there is some overconfidence right now in terms of data systems. And again, I say that in the sense that people, I think, are confident in the way that they're capturing their own data. But it's not until you start to figure out, okay, well, how do I share that data, or how do I ingest incoming data from some of my suppliers, that becomes sometimes, the gaps and cracks start to appear within those systems. Interoperability, that I think is going to be the dictionary word for 2026, maybe, at least when it comes to traceability, because it's really that concept of how do we start to share data in a consistent and structured manner. Now, remember, FSMA 204 didn't require any specific data standard. It said these are the key data elements that you need to have, but you can really capture those in any way that you want. And so that lack of standardization also creates challenges when we talk about things like interoperability. Next slide. So what should you do? Like I say, take the homework extension. I wouldn't start with the assumption that your systems are fully compliant until you really have started and done an in-depth gap analysis. And I say that both from an internal standpoint, am I capturing all the key data elements at the points in the process that I need to do that? And from a data sharing standpoint. And that's really where conversations with your suppliers and customers about tactical level data sharing. How are we actually going to do this? Are we getting the fields that we need? What are the systems? Am I going to use an ASN? Am I going to go all in and use EPCIS, or am I just going to rely on scanning of inventory when it comes in? And that's where we kind of pivot and start looking at those data sharing pilots. So again, for the pilot committee, we're going to be talking about developing some frameworks and some roadmaps and guidelines for people, if they want to go out and start to practice this, that you've got some tools to do that with. It's really going to come down to being able to pilot using the data that you have in the real world, and say, what level of performance am I getting? And finally, I think, as we head towards that time of compliance in July of 2028, being able to conduct a mock traceback, not a traceability exercise. And when I say traceability, again, we tend to think about that in the context of a recall event. So where did my product go? Broadly speaking, most people are good at that, and most companies are good at that. But when you actually start to try to trace that product back, moving backward in the supply chain, that's your traceback exercise. And I think that's going to be an important piece of helping to validate the systems that you're developing, both from an internal standpoint, but also from a shipping and receiving standpoint. Next slide. So if we have to leave you with some concluding thoughts, time is on your side for the moment in terms of compliance. Complexity, unfortunately, is not on any of our sides when it comes to anything, especially these days. But certainly when you're talking about redoing data systems and sharing data that you haven't shared before, data that hasn't even existed necessarily before. Think about the traceability lot code source. That's the place on the earth where the traceability lot code was assigned. And those of you who are familiar with FSMA 204 know that that can only be changed in certain instances, that at initial packing or transformation or first land-based receiving, if you're talking about seafood. So there's all this complexity that we need to account for in terms of data that hasn't existed. How should that be structured? How should that be shared? And that's really, I think, to wrap it all together, why the PFT exists. We recognize this was going to be an ongoing challenge, and we certainly invite you, if you have interest, if you've got interest in potentially participating in any of the pilots that we're thinking about, or just being part of the conversation. We put the website up here, but it's really kind of, I think, a wonderful opportunity to interact with industry peers, but also the regulators as well. And so this is going to take all of us to get this figured out, especially if we're heading towards July of 2028. So we can pause there and see if there are questions. I know there were a few that came through online. We can certainly tackle those however you want to handle it. Oops, and I can't hear you. I'm not sure if you're still on mute there.
Thank you. Of course, I was still on mute. I'm going to welcome anyone who wants to submit a question in the Q&A button, but we did get some pre-submitted questions that we'll ask and start with first. So first one, what are the differences in traceability between Canada and the US? And maybe we even extend that to like Europe and other places.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we have to understand that this rule extends beyond the US border. So it's any product that's going to be imported into the US. The expectation is that the same level of compliance and data tracking exists, right? So people, if you're, a shrimp producer in Southeast Asia, or, a fisher person in, Norway, or, somebody growing fresh produce in Mexico, all of those entities need to comply with the key data elements and critical tracking event requirements of FSMA 204 if they're going to export product to the US. So Canada doesn't really have a similar regulation in place, but many of the commodities that are US bound, and obviously we know there's a lot of trade between Canada and the US, are going to be impacted by this rule if they fall on the FTL food list.
Okay, great. And then discussions on the trace of non-FTL items, and how does accountability work there?
Yeah, I think that's been a big question. There are certain larger retailers within the supply chain now that have been kind of creating their own requirements, not just for FTL foods, but for all foods. A lot of those requirements really are based on primarily the GS1 standards. And so those standards have been out there for a while. I think, GS1's done a nice job of kind of crosswalking FSMA 204 compliance, and they've got a lot of resources on their website, in terms of here's what FSMA 204 requires, here's the way that our data standard can help you comply with that. Now, that said, every retailer's requirement that's come out has been a little bit different. And so I think, that is a challenge. I think we are seeing some delays in terms of actual implementation of those retailer specific requirements, recognizing again the complexity that's here in the supply chain and just the operational changes that everybody needs to consider or make. I think if you've got concerns about compliance and you sell to those retailers, it's always good to reach out to them and have that conversation, kind of let them know where you are in your FSMA 204 compliance journey, but also in terms of being able to meet some of their specific requirements. Eric, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add kind of a PFT approach, and then maybe something a little more kind of inspiring and encouraging around this topic. The way we've approached it in PFT is to really focus on the compliance piece, which is FTL foods, while recognizing the momentum is towards broader traceability. And obviously, no one wants to be using system A for FTL foods and system B for non FTL foods, right? So, whatever is getting developed and implemented, I think it's important to recognize that momentum and make sure that whether you're there day one or not, it's positioned and able to accommodate all foods. The other thing I'll just say, is, and I mentioned in my intro, I've spent the better part of my time over the last decade helping the farm industry implement traceability and drug traceability, and we're kind of coming out of that in the pharma space now. That implementation is mostly complete as of a little bit earlier this year. And the realization there was everybody focused on compliance and checked the box on compliance and kind of scratched their head a little bit like, did we move the needle all that much on the regulatory pieces? But also everybody kind of said, wow, it pushed us to another level of granularity of visibility that opened up so many additional business value adds, right? From inventory management and control and managing shortages and overages and recall efficiency. And I mean, it's just, as you start to see this implemented and get comfortable with it, it's going to drive to that next level of granularity and visibility that's going to start to open up business ROI. And so I think just keeping that in mind and trying to have some appreciation for that, as painful as it may be now, and thinking about that as part of your journey as well.
Okay. I'm going to pause on some of the pre-submitted ones because it looks like in our audience, Janelle has quite a few questions. So we'll start with, I'm trying to think the first one. Do you have any guidelines on how to do an effective gap analysis against the rule?
Yeah, I think to some extent it depends on which industry segment you're in, and a lot of the associations have developed kind of nice gap assessment tools. They're also, good tools on the FDA's website as well in terms of here are the KDEs and CTEs that I need to have and track. I think a good place to start is just to look at that list and say, am I capturing all of this information right now at that point in my process where I need to? So if I'm receiving product, am I getting all this information? What data systems is it going into? And how am I storing that information? How would I report out that information? If I'm manufacturing an FTL food, how do my ERP systems accommodate the data, the key data elements that are required under the rule? So all the lot codes that need to go into that process, and how am I assigning lot codes, and how am I assigning my traceability lot code source? So it really starts with an understanding of what the regulatory requirements are, and then overlaying those against your current data systems and practices. That's kind of a simple description of how I'd go about it, but there are a lot of resources online that help walk you through that. And certainly if you've got questions, more specific questions, you can reach out to me, and happy to share some of those resources.
Okay. She also asked, my organization issues plant-specific lot codes for all incoming materials. How might that practice be impacted by tracebacks?
Yeah, that's another question in terms of receiving and how you have to maintain the traceability lot code and traceability lot code source under FSMA 204. So when you receive an FTL ingredient, you're going to have to maintain the lot code that was assigned when that ingredient was received or that came in with that ingredient. If you're going to transform that into something else, another FTL food, that doesn't go through a kill step, and there's nuance in the rule, but generally you have to be able to link the incoming lot code into the product that you're manufacturing. So it is a common practice for a lot of companies to assign their own lot codes or next to the lot code that was provided by the supplier. And that's fine to continue to do that, but you just still have to maintain that data structure in a way that links the product that you made to the lot code that you received. And so, as people do these gap analyses and kind of restructure their data systems and operational systems, they just have to be aware that they have to still be able to have that linkage between receipt, transformation, and shipping.
Okay. And then the last question, which actually I've heard from some of our safety chain customers as well, is I'd like to understand how to address customers that are requiring compliance before compliance is required and guidance is fully developed.
Yeah, and I think that gets back to kind of what we were chatting about too before in terms of some of these retailer-specific requirements. It really is that. I think they're very similar issues, but as Eric mentioned, as industry starts to work through this together, I think there's some collective learnings that can get shared. But again, I would go back and say, be ready to have those conversations with those customers, especially given kind of the FSMA 204 compliance extension.
Yeah, and I might throw on there, Ben, just kind of a plug for kind of our PFT approach as well, and that it can be tough for any one organization to push back on those types of commercial requirements. Part of what we're trying to do is say, hey, let's get the critical mass of industry together to align on when and how this should work. And now, as part of a collective organization, right, that may start to carry weight that carries a voice that's different than you as one individual organization trying to push back on a large commercial requirement.
Okay. Going back to some of the pre-submitted questions, how do you, reviewing the exemption list, how do you determine if a company is exempt from the traceability rule?
Yeah, there's a pretty good tool on FDA's website that'll walk you through kind of who's covered or not. You can also go to the rule itself, but exemptions exist on company size or where you sit in the supply chain. Is the product that you're handling going to go through a kill step? There are ways to exempt yourself through kind of a contractual agreement. So it's a hard question to answer, singly without sort of knowing the specific case, but there are a lot of good resources, again, on the FDA website that cover when you would be exempt or who would be exempt. And even when you're exempt, that doesn't strictly exempt you from some of the record keeping requirements. So for example, like if you've got a grower selling directly to a grocery store, like a produce grower, there's still a minimal amount of records that need to be maintained in those instances. They may not have to assign traceability lag codes and things like that, but you still have to track that produce came from that particular grower, within that time frame. So a lot of layers to the onion in terms of exemptions. But again, those are kind of, to echo Eric's point, some of the valuable conversations that we do have too, or you can discover kind of peers that might be in a similar space as part of PFT.
Okay. How can food processors integrate digital record keeping or automated verification tools to reduce the human error in CCP/PC monitoring? And what features should they prioritize when they're evaluating a compliance tool?
Yeah, I think, first and foremost, does it match the business process that you have in place? Does it sort of fit well and lay well over that within your own internal operations? But then I think, the next important question is the one that we talked about early on in this presentation, and that's sort of data sharing or interoperability. So when you look at specifically talking about traceability, how easy is it to share my data with my customers, or how easy is it for me to take in data from my suppliers with whatever sort of software solution you've landed on? So, those are the types of criteria that I would look at in terms of evaluating service providers. Is everybody in the supply chain required to use the same software package, or can you sort of use that independently? There are different models and different solutions, and solution providers have approached that in different ways. So there's definitely not a one size fits all, but I think I always try to say, does it mesh well with the business process that I have, or do I have to fundamentally change a business process in order to use this piece of software? And I usually prefer the former rather than the latter.
Okay. Let's see. Some of these don't fully make sense. Is it required to always do the recon of materials when conducting the traceability or a mock recall?
I think if I'm understanding, are you trying to sort of verify what went where, so you can get a sense of accuracy overall? Can I go and physically find that product, in a distribution center or on store shelves and things like that? I think that matters more. That concept matters more in terms of recall, because the product, in theory, should still be there. You're trying to recall that product. When you're tracing something back, oftentimes the product's gone, right? It's been consumed, it's been sold. That's why we're conducting the traceback investigation, is to figure out what that potential source of contamination may have been. So when we think about kind of mock traceback exercises, I think it's more about being responsive to can I get reports out within 24 hours, because that's the compliance time frame in the rule, in a format that would be acceptable to FDA. And again, FDA on its website has an example of the sortable spreadsheet, which is an option to report those data to FDA. So it's more about, have I developed the right reporting systems for my technology systems? And does that data make sense? And am I able to provide it to FDA in the time asked? That's really what I think people will want to focus on when conducting these trace back exercises.
All right. Are there any other questions from the audience that we'd like to ask these panelists? Anything specific for like Eric? The one thing I am curious about, Eric, specifically, around some of the things that you learned from the life sciences space. As you mentioned, that traceability is mostly wrapped up on that side, and the timeline that it took to implement. Do you see a lot of learnings from that to be able to shortcut what we're doing on the food and beverage side?
Yeah, it's a question that comes up a lot, and I've got to start just by caveating. They're two very different industries, two very different supply chains, right? The farm industry is a much tighter. 92% of the product flows through 3 wholesale distributors, and 90+% goes one manufacturer to one wholesaler to one pharmacy, end of supply chain, right? And there is a little bit of repackaging, but generally you don't have as much of the transformation type of activity. So food is a much more complex, much more diverse supply chain. I'll start there. And the farm industry, too, started with lot level traceability. They actually knocked that out in about 14 months. And then the long tail on implementation has actually been driving down to the serialized individual package level. So there are some differences, but there's also definitely kind of lessons to be learned. I'll say one, recognizing just the value of standardization. I think one of the things that we've seen is a sense among the food industry of, we don't want to try to push things onto our customers or suppliers. We want to maintain as much optionality for folks as possible. But at the same time, that means you actually have to manage optionality, right? Versus the farm industry came in kind of day one, locked in on like, all right, we've got to define the one model for how this is going to work across the industry, right? And so they just came in with that orientation. So just really appreciating the value of standardization, even if that does have some pain kind of upfront. Two, one of the things we still see big challenges on there is master data. Like, the more work you can do to start getting your master data cleaned up, that's kind of one of these, our board chair often says, no regret investments, right? No matter where traceability goes, like, you won't regret kind of undertaking that effort. So master data is definitely a big one as well. And then third, as I said, the lesson that, everybody kind of goes through the regulatory implementation process, focus on the compliance aspect. But once you get through that, whether it's because you see the value or because your corporate leadership is going to start to come say, hey, where's our return on that investment? You're going to find those returns on investment from a business perspective in terms of getting to that next level of granularity as well.
All right. Well, perfect. If there aren't any other questions from the audience, we'll move on to wrapping this up. So just quickly, so everyone is aware, right? We do have a food and beverage manufacturing benchmark and survey report. There's a chance to win a $500 gift card. Scan the QR code, take the survey, help everyone in this audience, in our space, learn from how we can all benefit and get better in food and beverage. Next slide. I want to share, we're building out FSMA Fridays in terms of how many webinars you can register in advance. So in January, I'm super excited to join Dr. David Acheson, where we will be doing a look back at 25 and looking ahead to 26. Go to our website to register, and we'll also provide links as well when we send out the deck. In February, we're going to go over the FSMA Lab accreditation rule. What do you need to know? And that will be with Dan Rice. And then for March, we have planned practical insights from a former FDA official. Dawn will also join us in March for that session. All right. And if you're not aware, there's lots of resources, whether it's on the Acheson site, on Safety Chain, right? You can find e-guides, webinars, videos, and resources all within the resource section of Safety Chain, and same for the Acheson Group as well. Next slide. Oh, and then actually, I'm going to turn it over to Ian on our team to show you a demo of how Safety Chain can help you within the four walls of your manufacturing plant address the traceability rule.
Thank you, Dr. Ben and Eric. A lot of great info around FSMA 204, what is coming, how can your plant get ready, and what are the critical points that you need to pay attention to now and in the future. I'm Ian with Safety Chain, a solution consultant here to give you a walkthrough of how our platform can digitize your plant operations and help you be prepared for a scenario where, let's say, a customer complaint hits. So not end-to-end traceability, but within the four walls of your facility, how can we gather data quickly and with confidence? So in most facilities that we talk to, the data for traceability absolutely exists. It's just fragmented. Bankers boxes, pallets with binders, and tons of paperwork. Your data exists here, and it also exists in the systems of record you have, your ERP, WMS, email inboxes, maybe some spreadsheets and shared drives. It's a lot. And so when a complaint or a regulatory question comes in, teams are not missing the data. They're just missing speed and confidence. So when a complaint comes in, we're grabbing the box out of the filing cabinet or our storage warehouse. We're pulling a couple binders. We're searching through our paperwork to pull out our lot numbers, our timestamps, our CCPs, receiving checks, finished good checks. It's all done on paper and it's all very manual. It takes a long time to stitch it together. So you got to pull all this critical points from a lot of different sources, and it just takes a long time. In addition to this, you got to go through your systems of record, your ERP, your WMS, maybe a data warehouse to pull all the information together. It just takes a lot of time. And when you're doing this under pressure, it is costly. So involving a lot of resources potentially takes time and money. A lot of times we see a very heavy reliance on tribal knowledge. So only a few people can execute this. What happens when they're on leave, on vacation, away for the weekend, on holiday? It's tough. It's also a very error-prone process, and root cause analysis is almost non-existent, making the plant very reactive instead of being ready and proactive for these scenarios. And ultimately, for the overall organization, eroding margins from unnecessary recall volume, a lot of delayed decision-making during critical events when you need it most, and most importantly, potential erosion of customer and regulator trust. However, plants that are using Safety Chain can avoid all of this quite easily. So let's say we have a customer complaint. Let's pull all of our information that happened in the plant, all of our forms, our CCPs, and our checks. And we're talking in a matter of seconds or even minutes. So seconds, best case scenario. I'll show you how it's done in Safety Chain, and you'll get an idea of what it looks like for your facility. So let's pull the information. Immediate visibility into pass fail status. So where are our deviations? Nothing is hunted down. Nothing needs to be reconstructed. We don't need to piece elements together. If your data is set up correctly in the system, it's all there instantly. So for our Safety Chain customers currently, you might see one thing that might be new to you. This is the ability to create custom programs. So in my demo environment, I've created a traceability program. So I've tied certain forms to this traceability program, and I can filter on my program and pull all relevant information in one click. In addition, we can look at identifiers. So if your forms are set up to capture information as identifiers, then you can filter on that information also in just one click. So if I have lot numbers, work orders, batch numbers, you name it, you can pull those identifiers with one click, and anything with that associated identifier is pulled automatically. So I have an example of a garden salad, which has multiple ingredients in it. I've tied in all the ingredient lot numbers, so I can go one step backwards and one step forwards from this garden salad lot number and batch sheet. Now I'll transition to safety chain, and we'll see how we support this exact scenario across daily operations, not just during an event. So we'll start here. Safety chain mobile app. This is how data is captured at the point of execution. So we need to record the data in the first place in order to be able to act upon it. So this is the safety chain mobile app. Simple user interface, minimal training required to pick it up and be effective. Our customers are very familiar with this, but if you haven't seen it, this is our viewpoint, and I'll use my tasks to guide my work and my flow throughout my day. As an operator, I've got a batch sheet for garden salad ready to complete at this date and time, so organized for me. It pops up automatically when it's due, and I can see it and complete it. So my batch sheet, this is a representation of a digital form for your process. I have my spec sheet if I need to reference it as an attached document stored within the safety chain document repository. And now I'm guided for the information I need to collect. Let's start off with a lot number, and I'm going to use a scanner to collect my ingredient lot number scanned in. Now my red cabbage, I can pull that in with a scanner, making this error prone, making it friendly for the user, and making your operation more efficient. So cabbage, carrots, iceberg lettuce, I've got all the ingredient lot numbers tied to one overarching lot number for my garden salad. I've also got quantities and any other pertinent information required captured in a matter of seconds. Now that task is completed and it disappears from my workflow. And now I'll transition over to the safety chain homepage, accessible on my desktop, to show you what the data looks like and what is represented in these screenshots here. So welcome back to Safety Chain. This is our homepage that gives QA, ops, leadership a shared view of what matters. Exceptions are being surfaced automatically. Risks to my operation are visible without digging. Instead of reacting after issues are happening or being escalated, teams can see problems early, act quickly, and build processes to be very proactive. So something like a customer complaint, we've got the data available to us in seconds. Now on to my records grid. This is my real-time compliance view. As data flows in from the plant floor, it's here available real-time. So Bob Sanders completed our garden salad batch sheet for South Brunswick at 15:04 on the 17th. It was late according to my task schedule, and I have the record I can drill into with one click to show all the information Bob captured on the floor. I've got my lot numbers, as you can see, as well as the traceability program attached to this specific form. Now, let's say the customer complaint has come in. I'm in charge of gathering information. Since I've set my forms up to have identifiers, I'm going to search for a lot number. And in one click, I've got every piece of data collected for that lot number. I've got 5 forms that were collected, 7 records, and they're here viewable to me on my records grid newsfeed. Now I can drill into every record. I can pull up all the fields. So another quick viewpoint to see everything that was captured. And we actually have a print view for this exact scenario. If you need to share this as a PDF, you actually need to physically print it and hand it to someone. Whatever you need, we've configured our platform to help support efficient, confident operations. Now, in addition to filtering for lot numbers, as you may notice, it's very easy to do so. I can remove the filter with a click. And now I'll show how we can filter by a specific program that is set up in my facility. So an additional filter, 14 programs. Now this is housing your GFSI programs. Think SQF, BRC, ISO, etc. Safety Chain will manage the GFSI program for you, and our customers just assign their documents and forms to each section and subsection. And as records are submitted on the plant floor, they're all automatically tied into digital binders where you can pull records instantly. In this example, I've got a traceability program that I've set up custom for my facility. One click pulls me all relevant information I've assigned to the traceability program. So it's just for my South Brunswick location. And let's look what we have. In this scenario, it's everything related to garden salad. I've got all of my item reference, my supplier lot reference, my garden salad information, all the quality checks, they're all here. And if I want to add the lot level traceability on top of this, or lot level identifier on top of this, just one click and it's there for me. Making this really an efficient way to manage your plant. Now let me show you the program viewer so you can get a better idea of how the programs sit in the Safety Chain platform. I've gone over to the menu with one click and went into the program reporting. A lot of quick links available to our customers to make their lives easy. Once again, the traceability digital binder here available. So 8 forms and 19 records associated with this traceability program. These are being automatically filed. So think of how at the end of a production run, the paperwork comes into the office, hopefully, within 10 minutes of end of shift, but sometimes there's a delay. Maybe the next day you're then filing it away in your binders, in the filing cabinets, in the banker's boxes. This is done automatically for you. So my traceability program is available to me. I've highlighted my exception automatically. I can drill into this one specific record, or if I need to filter for a lot number to pull information, it's really available in seconds. Now, our current customers of Safety Chain, if you have not taken advantage of programs, we recommend getting in touch with your customer success manager to speak through how we can get this done and how it can fit for your plant. For those of you that are not Safety Chain customers, let's get in touch and see if Safety Chain is a fit for your plant. We work with a lot of food and bev manufacturing facilities and add a lot of value to their operations, but we're not a fit for everyone. So we'd like to talk to you to see if we can be a fit and we can help out your plant. This is just one small example of things that we can do as it relates to FSMA 204 and tracing your processes in the 4 walls of your facility. Now, thanks again for your time. Hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next month.
All right. Thank you so much. This concludes today's webinar. I hope I get to see you all in January again with Dr. David Acheson, and happy holidays. We love that you all come and join these webinars, and wishing you all the best in this merry season. Bye.